Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen. If you cannot, can somebody unmute and let me know? Zoom is acting a little weird this evening, so hopefully we're not having too many issues on your end. Please feel free to type in the chat and just let me know if you're having any problems. Just real quick, while we're waiting for a few more people to get on, just go over a few house rules, so to speak. I am going to ask everybody to keep their microphones muted throughout the presentation. There's going to be a lot of us on the call, and it's just kind of hard to answer questions that way if everybody's chiming in at once. So please feel free to use the chat box and type your questions in there, and I'll be stopping a couple times throughout my presentation to look and see what questions are in there and answering them at that point. So please feel free to use that chat box. If you're having problems with Zoom, seeing the presentation, those kinds of things, a couple of things you can do. The easiest is just to log off and log back on to the presentation. The other thing that you can do is turn your video camera off for the stronger internet connection on your end. That way you're only trying to get my video and not yours as well. And that can sometimes make things run a little bit more smoothly. Again, if you do have any problems, we will be recording this and it will be posted on our YouTube channel within a week. So if you miss anything or want to go back and look at anything, please keep an eye on our YouTube channel and it will be posted there shortly. So as I said before, I'm Kristy Morley. I'm the Senior Naturalist here at Wissahickon Trails, and we are going to talk all about how animals survive winter tonight. For those who are new to Wissahickon Trails and may not have joined one of our virtual programs before, we are an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania, founded a little over 60 years ago to protect the land and water of the Wissahickon Creek. To date, we have saved nearly 1,300 acres of land from development, and on that land are 12 nature preserves and 24 miles of trails that are open for your enjoyment, and hopefully you are aware of those. If you're not, please take a look at our website. There's a really great interactive map that you can see all kinds of information about the preserves and the trails that are out there. Because we are a nonprofit, we are actually very reliant on our supporters to continue to do the work of our mission. And so if you are a supporter on the call tonight, welcome, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, we couldn't do this without you. And if you're not currently a supporter, I encourage you again to take a look at our website, look through all the different kinds of projects and work that we have going on in the area, and maybe that will inspire you to become a supporter as well. So that being said, usually if you've been on these calls before, I start with a little bit of an outline of what we're going to cover tonight. I didn't do that tonight because it was kind of like giving away everything in the outline. So we're just going to dive right in tonight and talk right off the bat about winter realities. And what does that really mean when we say winter? First and foremost, temperatures fall. So in Philadelphia, our average winter temperatures, and I'm considering winter here to be pretty much December to March, if you will. Our average winter temperatures are about 29 degrees. We typically only have about 13 days a year where the temperature that does not go above freezing or 32 degrees. And about once every 5 years, we get as cold as 0 Fahrenheit, and usually only for a day or two. I have a couple comparisons for you, just so that you can get a sense. This first one I chose because I actually lived here for a couple of years, and 2 years was more than enough to experience the average Minneapolis winter. For those same 4 months, December to March, it's 14 degrees instead of our 29. That's downright balmy. The reality is in winter in Minnesota can actually pretty much last from October to April instead of more December to March like it is here. But the really cold months are those same 4 that we have. They have 69 days a year where the temperature doesn't go above freezing. And they can have 23 days in a year when the high temperature is 0. And negative temperatures are not uncommon. And I did experience that, and it is very cold compared to winters. And I grew up in this area, so I'm very much used to the winters that we have here. By comparison, someplace even colder than Minneapolis, Anchorage, Alaska, Only June, July, and August do temperatures stay above 32 degrees, both in the daytime and the nighttime. And in Barrow, Alaska, the average winter high temperature is -3. So you can see there's a wide variety of temperatures variation across the country, but in general, it's cold. The degree of coldness really depends on where you are. Along with that coldness comes less daylight. In both Philadelphia and Minneapolis, for comparison, we average about 9 hours of daylight in December and January, which are pretty much the shortest times of day that we have in a year. In Anchorage, by comparison, it's about 6 hours. But in Barrow, Alaska, the sun is below the horizon for 2 months. So pretty much it sets in late November and it doesn't rise again until late January. So they have almost no daylight. The sky does get a little bit brighter, maybe for 30 minutes to an hour as this, during that time. But for the most part, they pretty much don't have daytime during those winter months. So again, that's very much the extreme, but less daylight is very much a part of the situation in the winter. And so along with that goes this idea of this lack of resources. So as we've seen, the severity of the winter really depends on exactly where you are. But the winter always means this lack of resources, no matter where you are, because water's frozen, prey sources may be limited, plant-based food sources are largely dormant, the ground is frozen, it may be covered with snow, less daylight means less time to find resources, and colder temperatures just make it more difficult to do so. So what's an animal to do? Well, there's basically 3 means that sort of strategies that animals can employ to survive the winter. And we're going to talk about all of these as we go forward. But so the 3 main strategies, they can leave, they can hide, or they can adapt. So when we talk about animals leaving, we're talking about migration. And that literally is just the seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. And this is kind of the first and sort of most obvious strategy to survive winter, is just don't experience winter and go someplace else. And so not unlike some human beings that might migrate to Florida or Arizona during the harshest winter months from the northern US, a variety of animals will migrate away from winter. We probably tend to think of birds when we think of migration, but mammals and even insects can migrate. In some cases, they will leave winter areas completely, like our wood warblers that live here and other insect-eating birds. They can migrate to the Caribbean islands, South America for the winter. In other cases, like these snow geese, and this one sort of doing the wing flap here, this is a Tundra Swan. This is on the east coast of the Delaware coast, Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge in Delaware. And these guys migrate away from areas with really harsh winters, like the Arctic, to places that have less severe winters. So the Delaware Bay shore or the Jersey coast. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about migration. It is a very complex phenomenon, and there's lots of things that go on. And we haven't really talked about mammals and insects, just sort of birds here. But next month, I'm doing a program just on migration. So I know that there's a lot of people that signed up for tonight and signed up for that one, which is great. If you haven't and you're interested in learning more about migration, take a look at our website and sign up for that. But I don't want to spoil that program. So that's all I'm going to say on migration tonight. We'll talk more about it in detail later. So the next strategy is hide. And there's kind of a number of ways that we can hide. Animals can hide. But the first one that comes to mind is hibernation. And that's what we kind of think of when we think of winter and animals. And probably most of us, when I say the word hibernate, think of bears and hibernating bears. But I'm going to let you in on a secret that there's actually a little bit of debate among scientists as to whether bears actually do hibernate. And we're going to talk a little bit about the distinction and why they might not actually hibernate as we go through the next few slides. But suffice it to say that they do spend the vast majority of the winter hiding away in a den, asleep, and don't have to deal with the cold and the snow. A number of other animals hibernate, such as chipmunks and groundhogs. Possums and skunks don't really migrate, but don't really hibernate, but they do kind of achieve hibernation-like states to help survive the coldest and worst weather of a winter. So we're going to pause here to define a couple terms for you, because it's kind of, as I said, there's this argument about whether bears actually do hibernate. And so to be able to talk about that, we have to understand some of the terms around hibernation. So the first one at the top of the list there is torpor. And that really just means a state where physiological activity, so breathing and circulation and metabolism in general, are slowed down. Usually animals lower their body temperature, they lower how fast they process things through their system. Typically, this is thought of as sort of a light version of hibernation. Animals in torpor can awake more quickly than those who are hibernating. And so hibernating is really thought of as an extended form of torpor. It's just sort of the next level, if you will. The simple definition from Merriam-Webster says it's to pass the winter in a torpid or resting state. So it's really difficult when these terms use each other to define themselves. And it's no wonder that scientists can't agree whether bears actually hibernate or not. And as a silly aside, in trying to prepare for this and understand how to explain this to you, 3 different sites told me 3 different things about bears hibernating. One said they don't hibernate, one said they do, and one said they were super hibernators. So we're going to spend this evening pretty much referring to any state of slowing the body down and hiding, whether it's in a den or the mud in the bottom of a pond, as hibernation. There may be some specific differences between torpor and hibernation, but we're going to just talk about it as the general state of hibernation tonight, just to make everything easier. Bromation is another term you may or may not have heard, and this is essentially just hibernation for reptiles and amphibians. So it's a similar kind of thing. They slow their body down, they find a place to hide, away from the worst of the weather, and protect themselves from freezing. Denning is used in a couple of different ways. A lot of times it's referred to particularly the season in which bears find and dig dens to prepare for hibernation, like this bear shown here, but it also refers to any animal that creates a living space underground. And the duration that animals spend in a den for the winter kind of comes back to what we were talking about for the temperature early on. It depends on where you are. So it varies depending upon the latitude and so the severity of the winter. For black bears in Mexico, they could hibernate or den for a few days to a couple of weeks just because the winters aren't that bad. But in Alaska, the same black bears could hibernate for or spend the time in the den for up to 6 months. So it really just depends on where you are. For most animals in our area that hibernate, it pretty much starts in October, November, and lasts until about March or April for the most part. And we're going to look a little bit on that as we go through. And then the last term that you may have heard is a hibernaculum. And this is literally just a place where an animal hibernates. It does apply across species. So a bear den is a hibernaculum, but we tend to use this word when we're talking about species that either hibernate in a group, like snakes or bats. And for some reason, it also seems to be very much used when we talk about snakes. And because they tend to overwinter together. This is a homemade hibernaculum here, a picture that I just grabbed off the internet. I actually think this one was a picture from someplace in the UK that had made this, but literally it's just stacks of paving stones and the area in which they removed the turf to put the stones down, they piled it back over the top. And this just makes a really protected area for snakes to hide in the winter. And other reptiles might use them as well. Small mammals could even use something like that in some cases as well. So I don't want to confuse anybody with the terminology, but there is a lot of it out there. So again, as I said, tonight we're just going to talk about hibernation as the general state of affairs, but know that there can be specific terms that are used for different species. So before we talk about what actually sort of happens during hibernation, we really need to talk about preparing for it. First, an animal needs to find a place to hibernate. So like I just showed you on the previous slide, you know, snakes and turtles may find hibernacula like this, a bear's digging its den. They have to decide, you know, where they're going to put it. They might have to dig their own. They might reuse somebody else's from another season or even another species that's not using it at the time. They might look for a natural cavity like a cave or hollow fallen trees. Bats typically tend to go hibernate in caves as opposed to some other animals, although bears will do that as well if there's some accessible. Some animals will actually close the entrance to their den once they've made it and enter to hibernate, and others do not. They just leave it open. They dig deep enough down that they're protected further underground. During the months leading up to hibernation, most animals begin to lay down this heavy layer of fat. And I have an example here of two different bears. So bear 812 and bear 747. These bears are in Katmai National Park in Alaska. And you can see the top pictures are pictures of these bears from June 30th of 2020. And the bottom pictures are these bears September 20th, 2020. So 3 months later, they have spent this time on the Katmai River eating salmon. And you can see they ate a lot of salmon and put on a lot of weight. And this weight is almost all fat. And this fat is absolutely necessary to get them through the winter because that's what they will survive off of. And a number of other animals do this as well, but bears, it's often the most dramatic transformation that you can see. And for anybody who's interested in following along with this next year or anytime in the future, the Katmai Conservancy actually runs Fat Bear Week. And I know that sounds really funny, but they have a really cool live webcam that's on the river. You can actually watch the bears fishing for salmon, which is really kind of fun to watch. And you can watch some of the interactions between the bears. But then they also have kind of a, like we would think of as a playoff bracket set up for those who are into sports, where they pit one bear against another. And for 2020, bear 747 was actually the winner. And they post pictures, you know, of the different bears, and people go on and vote which one they think is the fattest bear for Fattest Bear Week. And 747 won for 2020. And it's a lot of fun when they do it. So I encourage you, go take a look and look at the webcam and see when the bears come back in the summer to eat the salmon. But that layer of fat, like I said, is absolutely crucial. So for the bears, these bears will lose up to a third of their body weight while they're hibernating. So a 400-pound male black bear, brown bear, sorry, these are brown bears, grizzly bears, might lose 133 pounds when hibernating. So they can lose a lot of weight. So that fat layer and stocking up is really important. So that's why places like Alaska, the salmon streams are really important sources of energy for those bears. Other animals that are preparing for hibernation will gorge on berries, seeds, nuts, anything that they can eat that's part of their normal repertoire to lay down that layer of fat before they go into hibernation. So when we talk about hibernating, there's a number of physiological adaptations that happen within individual animals. And when we're talking about hibernation, we're really talking about energy conservation. The whole idea of hibernation is really to protect an animal from the cold and the weather of winter in a way that they don't have to expend a lot of energy to do that. So when we think of hibernation, a lot of times we think of it as just this long sleep. And it kind of is, but it's also a lot more than that. So during hibernation, an animal will drop its body temperature. It will decrease the number of times it breathes every minute, so its respiratory rate will go down. It will reduce its heart rate. It will have no or limited, very limited eating and drinking for a very extended period of time. And it will have no or very limited waste elimination for extended periods of time. So if we just use the bears as an example, because we talked about them before in the laying down of the fat layer, a bear, like we just saw on the previous slide, can go 100 days without eating, drinking, or eliminating any waste. So that's a really long time. And you can't just sleep like a normal sleep and be able to not eat, drink, or eliminate any waste. They do process the fat that they've laid down. So they're creating energy for themselves. They're creating calories to run their body off of that fat layer. But instead of creating metabolic waste processes that they would excrete in urine or when they defecate, they don't do that. They actually break that fat down, and then the byproducts from that breakdown are actually recycled to help protect their proteins so they don't waste muscle while they're hibernating. And it allows them to maintain their muscle mass, and they're protecting their important organs like their heart and their brain. And that's really important because animals that go into the hibernating state without having laid down enough fat will start to break down their muscles. And so they're going to come out in the spring in a much, much more weakened state than they would if they had laid down that all important fat layer before they go into hibernation. So let's just compare a couple of different species of mammals and see what happens during hibernation. So for this chart, there's a couple of things that I've listed down the side here on the left-hand column. So whether or not the animal gains fat before they go into a hibernating state, whether they store food, how much their body temperature drops, how much their respiratory or breathing rate drops, how much their heart rate drops, whether they eliminate waste, and whether they may wake. And spoiler alert, they all may wake up during that hibernative state. The level to which they will wake up depends on the weather and the species and what's going on in their lives. So we'll talk about that in a second. But you can see pretty much everybody gains fat before they go into hibernation, except the chipmunk. But nobody stores food except the chipmunk. So it doesn't really need to lay down that level of fat because it stores food in its den, and it may cache food in other locations outside of its den, close to the surface, that it can go to if it wakes up and the weather's warm enough, and it can go find those. So it has a variety of mechanisms to be able to get through the winter without laying down that fat layer. But everybody else lays down that fat layer and they don't store food. Body temperature, this is one of those things. So you can see the chipmunk goes from 100 degrees to 45 degrees in the winter. So like half of its body temperature is gone. I mean, it's cold. Groundhog, same thing, 96 degrees to 47 degrees. Bears don't drop as much. And I think this is where a lot of the debate comes in between people who say they hibernate, people that say they're super hibernators, and people that say they're only in torpor, is because they don't have a dramatic body temperature. But if you look at the other things, the respiratory rate, so normal times, a bear breathes every a bear breathes 6 to 10 times every second when it's out and just living its life in the summertime. When they're hibernating, they take one breath every 45 seconds. So it's a significant drop in their respiratory rate. The chipmunk goes from 60 breaths a minute down to 20, and the groundhog, I couldn't find its base level rate, but when it's hibernating, the groundhog breathes once every 6 minutes. So you can see it's a really severely depressed respiratory rate. And that's what's really important about hibernation, is slowing everything down so that they can live off of their fat stores for the winter. Heart rate kind of does the same thing. Normal everyday life for a bear in the summer, its heart rate beats 40 to 50 times a minute. During hibernation, it goes down to 18 to 19. There's a lot of variation depending on the studies that have been done. Chipmunks, normal times 350 beats a minute. Their hearts beat really fast, but it drops to 4 beats a minute while they're hibernating. And groundhogs go from 100 beats a minute in normal times to about 15 when they're hibernating. Eliminating waste, as I said, the bear has very specific mechanisms by which it does not have to eliminate waste for a long time when it's hibernating. So it might not eliminate, depending on if it's particularly a bear that may be living here in Pennsylvania that doesn't have to hibernate as long as a bear that lives in Barrow, Alaska, for example. It may not eliminate waste the entire time it's hibernating in its den. Other animals do actually eliminate waste. Chipmunks do. Groundhogs I couldn't find a lot of information on, to be honest with you, for this. And the reason I put the possum and the skunk on here is because these guys are ones that definitely do enter the torpor state during winter, but they don't really hibernate. So they do gain fat before winter as a protective mechanism to, help them through. They don't store food. I can't really find any information on possum's body temperature, respiratory rate drop, or heart rate drop because they don't really hibernate. They go into sort of this, semi-slowed down state. When it's really cold or the weather's really bad, they may go into a den and hide for a few days. But for the most part, they're out and about in the winter. They're just not quite as active as they normally are. And skunks do a little bit more hibernating kind of behavior than possums, but again, they kind of can still be fairly active. And kind of like the bears, when they do go into this torpor state, they don't have a significant drop in body temperature, only about 10 degrees. So they do slow themselves down a little bit, but not nearly as much as, say, the chipmunk or the groundhog do. Now, as I mentioned, every single one of these animals, whether they're in torpor, whether they're in true hibernation, can actually wake up at some point during the winter if necessary. Typically, animals in torpor wake up faster and more easily than animals who are in deep hibernative states. But again, it's a matter of degree. Female bears actually give birth in their dens while they're hibernating in the winter. They wake up to do that. And then they go back into that depressed state of metabolism. And same with chipmunks and groundhogs. While they don't give birth in the dens, they can wake up if necessary. As I said, the chipmunk will wake up to eat every few days, a week or so. It will eliminate waste. It may leave the den if it's warm enough outside, or it may just stay put and live off the stores that it has in there. So you can see there's a lot of variation, but some very key things that happen to animals that spend the winter sort of in that hibernative state. The other thing I was going to mention about possums, for us in our area of Pennsylvania, we're pretty much at the northern end of their range. So because they don't hibernate, they can actually be exposed to the elements a lot more than some other animals. So they often suffer frostbite on their toes, on the tips of their tails, sort of that unprotected area that they have on them, because they really don't spend much time in that hibernative state. So I'm going to stop here and see if we have any questions. I don't see any in the chat box now, but feel free to ask, type your questions in there as I'm going along, and I will stop in a little bit and see if we have any questions. So for some species, winter survival depends on being part of the crowd. So most mammals that we just saw, like the bears and the chipmunks and the groundhogs, tend to hibernate alone. They dig their own den or find their own hole, and they stay there by themselves for the winter. The one exception to that is bears who have cubs that are just a year old. They will hibernate with those cubs, but that's pretty much the only exception. Everybody else kind of goes their own way. A few species like snakes and ladybugs and bats, they form large groups that hibernate together. And this is really just there's a couple of reasons why. So if you look at snakes, for example, even different species will hibernate in the same place. So this picture that I have here is, there's actually 4 snakes in here. These are Decay's brown snakes. They're a very common, very small snake that lives in our area. They're only about a foot long, full grown. They're adorable, in my opinion. I know everybody has their own opinions about snakes, but these guys are really cool. And this is not actually a true hibernaculum, but I was out looking at salamander cover boards, which is a study that we do as part of our community science. We have people that go out and monitor these for salamanders. This is a corner of the board up here that we have put these boards out in forested areas, and volunteers go and look for salamanders under them. And this was a very early March day, so it was rather chilly, and pulled up the board and found these 4 little snakes hiding under there. But that's exactly what they do in the winter, and usually it's just in larger groups. Snakes will often go back to the same hibernacula every year, and there can be hundreds of snakes in a really successful hibernaculum, and even different species of snakes will spend the winter together. And again, like mammals, their states of hibernation involve slowing their metabolism down. They rely on the air temperature to keep themselves warm to begin with. So even, in the summer, that's why you see snakes sunning themselves on rocks to warm up, so to speak, in the morning, for example. And so having large numbers of snakes in a hibernacula together keeps that temperature more constant than if there were only 1 or 2 snakes in there. And so it's just a mechanism of survival strategy. Likewise for the ladybugs, certain species of ladybugs will actually return to the same hibernaculum every year, just like the snakes do, and bats do as well, to the same caves where they have hibernated probably all of their lives. And again, I'm not sure, not all ladybugs do this, but the ones that do, again, it's probably just a safety in numbers kinds of things. And there may also be specific components that all of them being together sort of help each other, if you will. And that's not one that has been studied quite as much as, say, like the snakes have been, which is more about temperature control. Another mechanism that animals tend to do is to bury themselves. And so pretty much all the animals that you see on this page, we have a box turtle here, a green frog, a snapping turtle, and a redback salamander. These guys pretty much just employ a strategy of hiding in the mud or burying themselves in a hole in the dirt. So for turtles and toads that tend to live on land for most of their life cycles, and things like the redback salamanders, they will dig themselves burrows, hide themselves as deep as they can get, look for secure areas under a log, deep in fallen leaf litter, within the edge of a forest, things like that. Anything that's going to help protect them. And again, they all employ that mechanism of slowing their metabolism down so that they're not eating, they're not drinking, their respiratory rates and their oxygen needs are much, much lower than they would be when they're normally, living their life in the woods. So things like green frogs and snapping turtles that live in the water to begin with, although this snapping turtle is probably it's probably a female, and she probably either just laid eggs or is looking for a place to lay eggs, because they don't lay them in the water. They lay them in a scrape that they make out on land. So these guys tend to bury themselves in the mud of a pond, a river that's not freezing, you know, hiding in the edges of the mud. Again, anything that they can do to protect themselves from those temperature extremes. And these guys that live in the water have a little bit of an advantage because water itself can be an insulator. So for some of these other creatures like the salamanders or the box turtles, and even some of the mammals, if they live in an area that has a constant snow cover, that's actually really helpful because it keeps that temperature at a constant, more constant level. It's cold, but it's constantly cold. But the freezing and thawing kind of cycle where it snows and then it gets really warm and all the snow disappears and then it snows again and the same thing happens. It gets warm and all the snow disappears. That kind of cycle can be actually much harder for land-based creatures to protect themselves from, because that layer of snow provides insulation that, you know, if it's not there, they don't have. And likewise, water provides a layer of insulation. Now, obviously, in some cases, if the water's shallow enough or it doesn't move enough, in cold weather, it's going to freeze, and it can freeze all the way down to the bottom. But a lot of times these creatures will move to places where it's deep enough that it doesn't freeze. They will bury themselves into the mud at the bottom of that area. And so it's cold, but it's insulated. And again, they're slowed down so they don't have to expend as much energy. Turtles have a really, aquatic turtles have a really cool mechanism as well that helps them survive those situations. Because one of the things that's important when we breathe, we're doing oxygen transfer, right? Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And that oxygen is really important to all living creatures. And these guys, while they're in the water, if it freezes, that oxygen transfer becomes much more difficult, if not impossible, because the oxygen's just tied up in that ice. They kind of need that flowing water. Turtles have a unique adaptation. And I'm just going to say it, they breathe through their butts. They have an area around their tail that is extremely vascular and really important for oxygen exchange. So they can actually spend pretty much the entire winter at the bottom, as long as they have some water that is moving that oxygen and not have to come up to breathe. And so that's really important in protecting them and making it able for them to survive the winter, because they don't actually have to surface to take a breath during the winter. The next mechanism that some frogs and some insects, as you'll see, use is they literally freeze themselves. This on the top here is a wood frog. This on the bottom is a spring peeper. And both of these guys are much smaller frogs than like a bullfrog or a green frog. And they don't dig as well. Their feet just aren't as strong. Their legs aren't as strong. So it's difficult for them to bury themselves in the ground. And these frogs tend to be, while they're often near water for their breeding cycles, they're actually terrestrial frogs. So they spend most of their time out on, you know, in the forest and on the forest floor and in small shrubs and things like that. So it's harder for them to dig a hole to hide in for the winter. So they employ a method that literally lets them freeze. As it gets cold and they come in contact with like the first frost, and there's a physiological adaptation that they realize that, oh, that's frost, that's ice, I need to protect myself. Their liver actually secretes this really, really viscous sugar solution. And it's often referred to as antifreeze, but it's not really antifreeze. I mean, these frogs are solidly frozen. You know, their eyeballs are frozen. For all intents and purposes, they look dead. Their heart doesn't beat. They are frozen solid. So the antifreeze component, really what it does is it coats the cells so that any ice that forms inside the creature forms in between the cells as ice and not through the cells. Because when you freeze a cell and then thaw it, it usually explodes, which is why freezing is not a good thing for any animal in most cases. But these guys have created this adaptation, that allows them to protect their cells and all the important components of their cells while freezing at the same time. Which I think is like absolutely phenomenal. This is like a really cool thing. I've never seen one of these frogs, you know, in its frozen state. But I think it would be absolutely amazing to see that, because then when the temperature warms up in the spring, they thaw from the inside out and they work just fine. And scientists actually are trying to study these kinds of creatures to understand how that solution that they produce actually protects cells, because this could have implications for human health in some respects. Freezing is not a good thing for us, and you know, sometimes people, you know, that's how frostbite happens. And are there things that we could learn from these frogs that could help us prevent frostbite or treat people who have frostbite or other significant issues like that? So pretty cool frogs. The next one is that we're going to talk about is an idea called diapause. And this is something that, kind of like we said, brumation is hibernation for snakes and reptiles, or reptiles and amphibians, sorry. Diapause is really kind of a hibernative state for insects. And not all insects do this, and not all insects do it in the same way. So we're going to talk about a couple of different ideas here. First, we're going to look at the life cycle of a ladybug, just so everybody remembers and understands what the life cycle of most insects look like. So you start with an adult ladybug. A female ladybug will lay eggs on a leaf in a field somewhere. And once those eggs hatch out, they go through a larval stage. And this depends on the species, how long that larval stage is. Then they go into a pupa state, and then they develop into a ladybug. So there's a couple of, it's called complete metamorphosis. These 3 stages look nothing like the adult ladybug. And so they sort of have, the eggs are all the same, like for across species, the eggs are eggs, but the larval stages and the pupa stages can be very different between species, and they can always look very, very different from the adult of that species. So when we talk about butterflies and moths, just so everybody's on the same page, a caterpillar is the larval stage of a butterfly and a moth. And the pupa stage of a butterfly or moth is either, for butterflies, it's the chrysalis, and for moths, it's the cocoon. So just so everybody understands that the same way. So we have a few butterflies in our area that actually do survive as adults during our winter. This is a question mark butterfly, and this is one of those species. This is a species, so this isn't diapause. This is more like hibernation. It will look for sheltered areas in wood piles or loose siding or under a log, and it will employ mechanisms kind of like the wood frog and the spring peeper do, where it will freeze and protect its internal organs and hang out that way until it gets warm in the spring. Because they're adults and because they're already here, these are often some of the first butterflies that we see in the spring. And during a real warm spell, even in like March, before we would necessarily think of it being spring, or even February, if it gets warm enough, these butterflies can come out at that point and go looking for food sources. We don't really have many flowers blooming at that point in time, but they will seek out trees that might be dripping sap and things like that to get nutrition from during those winter warm spells. Excuse me. Other insects also employ mechanisms of hibernation for the winter, one of which is a yellow jacket. This is a queen yellow jacket that I actually found under a log when I was looking for salamanders at our Crossways Preserve in March, and she's hibernating. Basically, only newly fertilized queens from a colony hibernate for the winter. The rest of the colony typically dies off. And when she emerges in the spring, when it gets warm, she will go search out a new place to start a new colony and lay the eggs that she was fertilized with the previous fall. So it's kind of a different, you know, these kinds of creatures and insects live in a communal environment during the summer and their breeding season, but during the winter, only certain members of the species actually spend the winter. The rest die off. So again, these kinds of insects that are spending the winter here as an adult are still kind of in hibernation, for lack of a better word. The woolly bear caterpillar, on the other hand, this is a caterpillar that will become the Isabella tiger moth when it goes through its metamorphosis from its pupal stage to its adult stage. Now, this is the larval stage. This is a caterpillar of this moth. Diapause is what happens to this species. This caterpillar, as such, will spend the winter. It, again, will look for a deep layer of leaf litter, a brush pile that's protected. It might sort of bury itself in a little bit of dirt. Again, exude some cryoprotectants within its cells so that they don't freeze and rupture. Excuse me. And in the spring, when it warms up, it will come out. It will look for some food sources to, you know, kickstart its metabolism again. And it will probably eat for a few days and maybe up to a week. And then it will go find a place to spin its cocoon and take the next couple of weeks to turn into an adult moth. So the fact that it spends the winter in this larval state is what is considered the diapause. So it's paused its development cycle before to survive the winter. And this, so spending the winter as a caterpillar and or a larval state for insects, because not all insects are caterpillars in the larval state, but to spend the winter in that larval state or to spend the winter as a pupa state are the most common ways that insects spend the winter. This is a chrysalis of a black swallowtail butterfly that I collected the caterpillars from this in late September from the fennel in my herb garden, mostly because there wasn't much left. And I knew that they weren't going to become butterflies before the winter happened because it was too late in the season. And they know that as well. Temperature changes, decreasing day length. Those are the kinds of things that stimulate all of these animals to know that winter is coming. And so these caterpillars knew that there wasn't enough time for them to go into their chrysalis state and then come out and be able to reproduce successfully and in the time that they had left in the season. So they paused themselves, and there was a whole bunch of them that I collected actually that spent the winter in my garage because it was the one place I could be sure would be cold enough that they wouldn't come out accidentally. If they were in my house, they might have come out much earlier, which would have been bad because there wasn't anything to eat. But this is the caterpillar, the chrysalis, in June of 2020. So in October, they were put in a cage, protected in the garage. And when it got warm, I brought them out so that they knew it was warm and sunny. And it took them until June to come out, but they knew what to do. And they were all perfectly healthy butterflies that flew away. It was really cool. So again, I encourage you, if you have an herb garden and you're growing things like dill or fennel and the black swallowtails are laying eggs on it and you see small caterpillars, it's a really cool opportunity to try to see their life cycle up close. And they'll form a chrysalis very readily in a container as long as they have a food source to sustain them as a caterpillar. And then you just watch and wait what happens. And if it gets to be October and they're not out yet, put them someplace cold, and bring them out in the spring. A lot of our native bees do the same thing. The bees will lay their eggs underground, provide protective coverings for their eggs, leave a packet of pollen and nectar to feed the egg, and sometimes that egg may not turn into a full-fledged bee until the next season. And so again, it's just that idea of we're pausing at a certain stage in development, and this is something that the insects do really well to get them through the winter. And the last way that animals can survive the winter is adapt. So, and this is probably the one that we're sort of the most familiar with, I think, because we see it around us all the time. So animals like coyotes or foxes will grow really thick coats. You can kind of see in this coyote picture, this is actually a coyote from my front yard when I lived in, or side yard when I lived in Minnesota. And you can see real thick coat. Minnesota winters are cold. He's out in the snow. She's out in the snow. Yeah, they were hunting. They were doing their thing. So real thick coat. Sometimes they adapt their food sources. So foxes in the summertime will often eat more sort of berries and fruit kinds of things, and insects like grasshoppers and things like that. In the winter, they tend to switch their diet to more small mammals. So going after things that are more available because, you know, the berries may be gone already. And insects aren't around as much. So those kinds of things, that adaptation. Birds do the same thing. So this is a yellow rumped warbler. Most warblers, and including this one, during their summertime breeding season, they eat insects. And insects in the winter aren't very plentiful. Like we saw before in the previous slide, they're all hiding someplace in the ground, under a log, and they're just not as active and moving around as much. So yellow rump warblers have an adaptation that they can actually eat the berries off of like cedar trees and the myrtle trees along the Jersey Shore and things like that. So they actually just switch to eating berries. And robins do the same thing. We have robins here pretty much all year. They're just not as obvious because they're not on your yard pulling worms out of it, or on your grass pulling worms out. They're in the woods looking for berries and, you know, scraping through leaf litter trying to find insects that have hidden themselves there. So it's a bit of a dietary shift. And then we might see opportunistic animals like white-tailed deer or squirrels. My notes say may. I'm going to say will take advantage of bird feeding stations, for example, as an easy source of high-calorie seeds and nuts that help sustain them through the winter. And again, even this deer, you see this has a much thicker winter coat on it to get it through the winter successfully. And deer may also switch the kinds of things they eat. They're still going to eat plant material in the winter, but they kind of switch kinds of plants because of what's available. Couple last things, specific adaptations that birds have. So birds may roost together, like these bluebirds here, to conserve heat. They also use their feathers as insulators. So these birds are puffed up. You can kind of see that here. And the feathers being puffed out creates this sort of layer of warm air that's held against their bodies and just helps insulate things better than if they laid their feathers down flat. It often makes birds in the winter look bigger than they really are, just because they're all puffed out and they tend to look very round and puffy. This is really important. An important reason why, if you have a bird feeding station in your yard, that it's also a really good idea to have a source of fresh water for birds in the winter, because in order to keep this feather insulating layer working properly, their feathers need to be clean. So birds will actually bathe in the winter, not as often as they do in the summer, but they will bathe and they will preen just to make sure that their feathers are in tip-top shape to help keep them warm. You see these birds roosting together here on the branch, kind of smashed together to help conserve body heat. Cavity nesting species like some of our chickadees and our titmice, they actually may roost together in small family groups or small flocks during the winter to avoid extreme cold and bad weather. They don't really hibernate. They don't necessarily really slow themselves down. They need to go out and eat every day, but they will use nest boxes or hollow logs, holes in trees to protect themselves from the worst of the weather. And then evergreens and dense shrubs are really important hiding places for non-cavity nesters during the really bad weather as well. And oftentimes you can find a variety of different birds sort of sharing the same holly tree or cedar tree during the winter, especially when the weather's really bad, because those evergreen leaves just provide another layer of protection and insulation from those extremes. And another really cool adaptation that birds have, and more specifically most waterfowl have, to keep their feet from freezing. So these geese are standing on the ice in Minnesota. This is actually in Minnesota in the winter. And they don't seem at all perturbed by the fact that they're standing on the ice. And that's because they have a specific system of circulation in their feet. The technical term is countercurrent heat exchange. But basically what it means is that the cold blood that's coming back up from the bottom of their feet that's on the ice is surrounded by, so the vessel that the blood is in is surrounded by veins that have, or surrounded by arteries, sorry, that have warm blood going down to the feet. So basically, as the cold blood is coming back up from their feet, it's being warmed before it hits the body by the warm blood going down their feet. And so it just means that there's no sort of shock to the system. It's kind of like by the time it gets the blood coming back up from these really cold feet is in the whole part of their circulatory system, it's at the same temperature that the rest of the body is. So it doesn't shock the system in any way. They also have specialized scales on their feet that can help protect them from freezing. And then you'll notice oftentimes if you see geese, they're like standing on one foot, or other water birds are standing on one foot. Part of that is as well, now when we have one foot that's cold. And so it offers some protection to that other foot and limits the amount of heat exchange that their body has to do to keep that blood warm. And sometimes they'll even sit down on the ice or the snow. Same thing. It keeps their feet up close to their body under their downy feathers on their belly and their chest. And again, just protects them from the cold. So that's what I have now. I do see a couple questions that came in, so I'm going to stop to answer those. I do just want to point out a couple of things that we have coming up. As I said, February 18th is the All About Migration program. We are going to have an annual meeting on the 23rd of February. I apologize, I don't have a lot of details yet on this, but it's an opportunity just to come hear about the work that we're doing. Keep an eye on our website because there'll be more details coming. March 2nd, there's a program on the dance of the Timberdoodle. For those who are not aware of what a Timberdoodle is, it's an American woodcock. It's a really funky, unique bird that has an absolutely fantastic mating ritual. Song and dance, literally, kind of. So if you're not familiar with that and you want to come check it out, please join us on March 2nd. Having a virtual bio blitz, since we still can't really do things in person. I'm not going to go into it here. There's a ton of information on our website about what that is, but feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions specifically about that, because I would love to help answer questions to get more people involved in doing that with us. And then April 8th, all about warbler identification. So this one's going to be a little bit of an advanced birding kind of program, specifically focusing on identification of warblers. But again, even if you're not a really advanced birder, you might want to check it out. So all on our website. There will also be some hikes added coming up. Just don't have details on those yet. So let me take a look at the questions here and see where we're at. Okay, whoops. So how do snakes and ladybugs find their way back to the same spot they hibernate? That's a good question, and it probably has a lot to do with some of the migratory things that we're going to talk about next time around. I haven't actually looked into that specifically, but a lot of those things are sort of either genetically imprinted into an animal because that's where their parents went. And it's just a species kind of a thing. I know the ladybugs, they actually secrete chemical hormones while they're in their hibernacula that help other ladybugs find them in future years. Because ladybugs, for example, probably don't live that long. Life cycles of insects, for example, are not particularly long in most cases. So they like leave traces for the next generation to know that this was a good spot to spend the winter. Snakes, I'm not sure, but I'm going to look into that for the migration one because it's kind of related to that kind of thing in my mind. So, yeah, I say, I'm not sure if everybody can see my screen with the questions on it. So I'm just going to read this. It seems incredible that bears give birth during the period of hibernation. How in the world does the female bear have the bodily resources to nurse? Do the cubs live in a somewhat torpid state? And how does all this work? Yes, the female bear has the resources to nurse because she's laid down that incredible layer of fat. And that's why that layer of fat is so important, and particularly for the females, because that's where she's going to get that energy from to create milk and nurse her young. The cubs, they're, first of all, when they're born, they're really small. So they need energy, but they don't need as much energy as if they were out running around immediately. They are small. They are kind of like puppies and kittens. Like well, even humans, they're not ready to go right away. So they take time to kind of finish the development, and that can happen in this somewhat torpid state. The mother is giving off body heat while she's in this state. Again, this may be one of the reasons why bears don't decrease their body heat to the same extent that say the chipmunks or the groundhogs do, because particularly female bears need that body heat to protect their cubs. And being in a den, in an enclosed space, that weather and cold air, can't immediately get in, that just offers that level of protection. Yeah, and it is kind of pretty fantastic, but it works. What happens if bears do not sufficiently fatten up prior to hibernation? And that's really, I think I said, the idea that they're going to go through their muscle mass when they're hibernating. So, and in theory, they could go through enough of their muscle mass or cause damage to key organs that they might not be able to survive. So that layer of fat is really, really important for that reason. So the next question is, have any of the winter techniques animals use shifted due to climate change? And are there specific animals that you can point to that may have? So yes, climate change is changing animals' winter habitat or winter survival strategies. I'm having a hard time pointing to one in specific, but I think it's more along the lines of thinking about, so a chipmunk or a groundhog actually is probably a better example, because they don't store food, and so they don't wake up as often. And they're true hibernators compared to, say, the chipmunks, which store food and wake up frequently to feed. We may see groundhogs out and about more often in the winter, our winter, just in this immediate area, and or see them out earlier than we would have before, because overall our winters are warmer, we don't have as much snow, They may have access to food sources that they wouldn't have had before. So it's more things like that. Likewise, bears. Bears might not have to hibernate for as long, particularly in our specific region, because the winters aren't as bad as they used to be, and aren't as cold, and aren't as, you know, the weather's, there's not as much snow on the ground, those kinds of things. For insects, and there's not really much of a change. Butterflies, for example, physically cannot fly unless it's 50 degrees, 60 degrees. I can't remember right off the top of my head, somewhere in that range. And so, you know, it's still going to be cold enough here in the winter that butterflies are not going to be flying around trying to find food. So I think there are some changes that are happening, and it's more probably on the mammal end and than it is, say, on the insect end. And we may see more, you know, turtles may have an easier time, for example, because it's just not as cold, or frogs for that matter. So birds and squirrels, harsh days and nights, where do they spend the time during the winter weather? As I said, evergreen trees, nest boxes, holes in trees. Squirrels actually do build nests in trees, which they will use in harsh weather. Each individual squirrel actually has multiple nests that it sort of makes the rounds about, and it will usually fortify one or two of them against the winter. And so adding layers of leaves for insulation, and during really bad weather, that's where they'll hang out. So again, this kind of follows up the bear hibernation in Alaska versus Mexico. And so what do bears in our area do as far as hibernation, full-blown sleep? When do they emerge? Typically, bears in our area will start to emerge March or April. That's typically when the worst of our winter is over. And they may not go into a den until late October, or even maybe just November or December, depending on their access to food around there. So, for example, in our area, the bears are not fattening themselves up on salmon streams because we don't have any salmon streams here. So the bears in our area are gorging themselves on berries that they can find. They're gorging themselves on nuts. And so in areas where there's a lot of access to tree nuts, say in a mast year when the tree nuts are just, an immense number of them are available for animals to eat. Given that our winters are not as extreme as, say, someplace like Alaska, those bears may not hibernate until November or even December. And they might come out a little bit earlier. March timeframe is still probably reasonable. They probably don't go into as deep a hibernation or torpor state, whatever you want to call it, as bears in Alaska do. They don't need to. It's not as cold, the weather's not as bad, and it may be warm enough for them to actually wake up and go look for food if they need it during the winter. So they can, you know, sort of have a little bit of a different approach to winter in an area where it's not quite so bad. But they still typically will do some level of hibernation. They're not active all year long. Question about birds. Is it okay to feed during bad weather then discontinue in spring? Absolutely. Most of us put bird feeders out. And if anybody had an opportunity, there is a recorded webinar like this on our YouTube channel about setting up a bird feeding station if anybody's interested. And it is absolutely okay to feed during the winter and take down in the spring. Most birds rely on insects during the spring because, and during their breeding season, they're trying to build protein for breeding, and then they're feeding babies. And so they tend not to visit our feeders quite as much anyway, because they want a different food source during that really active time of their breeding cycles. So yeah, absolutely take your feeders down in the spring, no problem. And bonus tip, if you live in bear country, always take your feeders down in the spring, because you don't want the bears visiting during the spring and summer to feed off of your bird feeder, because they will. And don't put your bird feeder up until the bears are in their dens in the fall. Do birds eat snow to get water during periods of sub-freezing temperatures? No, actually they need liquid water, and it is a challenge. And that's why it's one of those things where if you find an open water source in the winter, you're often liable to find a lot of birds, especially if it's a freshwater source. And that's why I recommend that if people have feeding stations in their backyard, that you have some kind of a water source. That presentation has a couple of suggestions of how to do that for the winter. I have one that's got a thermostat in it, and it's a self-contained unit, and I can plug it in and it will keep the water running so that they can drink and eat all winter. One of the things, an example that I use for this is the woodcocks that I was talking about having this program for. So they're migratory birds, and for some reason there's a lot of them in the winter in the Cape May region. And probably it's just because the winters in the tip of New Jersey, because of the ocean, tend not to be as bad. They do get snow, but they often don't get as much snow as we do. But when they do get snow, the woodcock that are there, they need to feed in soft soil. And so you can often find them on the edges of the road where salt from the salting of the roads has sort of thawed the edge of the mud and the dirt along the edge of a road. And you'll often find birds in the same situation in the winter. When it's been really frozen for a while, they will congregate in puddles that are like on the roadside, because that's the only, non-frozen water source. Absolutely. Somebody says, Deborah says, would it be better if we don't clean up our leaves and other debris in the yard through the winter in case some insects or small mammals need shelter, and clean up late in spring when they may be gone? Absolutely. What I typically recommend is, because I understand people want to protect their grass, my first suggestion is try to reduce the amount of grass in your yard, make your garden bigger, and then, you won't have as much of an issue. But I do understand that people want to be able to keep the grass protected. And if you let it sit under leaves for all the winter, sometimes that doesn't do great things for the grass in your lawn. And I understand that. So what I often recommend is people take some of the leaves from their yard, and rather than putting them out on the street to be picked up or put in a bag to be thrown away, find some spot where you can make a pile of them in the back of your garden, or sort of use them to mulch the garden for the winter. And so that you're allowing anything that may be attached to those leaves, or anything that wants to go into your garden, to have that leaf litter layer to survive in the winter. And I know I was noticing today, I have an area in the back of my yard that has a bunch of shrubs in it. And I basically took almost all the leaves from my yard and just dumped it in where the shrubs are. And I'm just letting it sit there for the winter. And today I had a flock of about 25 robins in my yard, and there were a few in the yard, but the worms are down low. That's how they survive the winter. So the robins aren't going to be pulling worms out of the grass, but man, were they in that leaf litter looking for bugs under all those leaves, and they loved it. So it's not just the insects or the small mammals that you may be protecting and helping through the winter. It may be things like robins and sparrows as well, because they're going to come there looking for food as well. So I see a lot of possum and raccoon activity all winter long. So no, they don't really hibernate, either one of them. They will simply hide in the worst weather. And if we have a blizzard and we have 4 days of snow or something like that, then they'll take shelter, both the possums and the raccoons. But as soon as the weather clears up and it's no longer snowing or raining, they'll be right back out looking for food. So no real hibernation there. So I don't see any other questions. I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you get a chance, if you haven't already, check out some of the other programs that we did last year that are all on our YouTube channel. And I know I saw a lot of multiple signups for this year, so hopefully this has piqued your interest in, if you hadn't already signed up, some of the other programs. So thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you all at the next one. Have a good evening, everyone.